Good morning, everyone. See you here on this bright, shiny day. And welcome back for, maybe this is sort of part 2 of our journey. We've got something on listening today, and then we're going to do something on Simeon and Anna, listening in the late stages of life. In our family, our nephews and nieces call us the Grays. They're the greens, and we're the grays. So next month it'll be listening as a gray. And then we're going to do something on the prophet Joel about how to build up the dreams of the youth. And we'll finish with something on Pope Francis on prayer. I love that line, and I always think it's worth repeating that line. The church has to initiate everyone, priests, religious laity, into this art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. I was listening to a quote by a medical doctor, and they were talking about the real need for healing in people's lives, and that's where this quote came from. They asked him what was the greatest healing need that he'd experienced in his life as a doctor, and that was his line. There is in the human heart the boundless desire to be heard. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, this boundless desire to be heard. And it emerges so early in our life too. I'm captivated by, I remember seeing a picture of a little child. They were sitting on their mother's lap, and the mother was talking away to somebody else, and the little kid reached up and took the mom's face and physically turned it towards the kid. And the mom said, "Quiet, Tommy, mommy's talking." And the kid said, "But I want you to listen." But it was this physical act of saying, taking this face and turning this face towards the child and said, "But I want you to listen to me." And I think there is that great desire in us to want to be heard. And I think it's so much a part of our tradition of faith too. So we're going to start with a reading, probably a key reading about Jesus' teaching about the importance of listening. So can you do that for us? Oh, thanks. Is this not turned on?
No.
I don't know.
Is this on?
Is it on? Should it be turned higher? Thank you. Maybe somebody could do something with it. No, they've got machines to do this. Why don't we wait? Thank you very much for that. The last time we tried this, it was echoing around the church, so I've tried to stay away from it. So. Test. Any better?
No.
No better. Anybody know how to make this work?
I need any more.
Is there one of these over here?
Try the other one.
Pardon?
See if this one's good.
Test. Oh, that one worked. Maybe we'll just switch. I'm not sure what we do, Teresa. That might be good enough. Thank you. Is that better? I think that's better, eh? Yeah. Thanks, Teresa. We'll try again.
A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. The reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. With them indeed is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah that says, "You will indeed listen, but never understand, and you will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing. And they have shut their eyes, so that they might not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Truly, I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but do not see it, and to hear what you hear, but do not hear it."
Thanks, Helen. So Jesus was concerned from the very beginning about how we listen and wanting to encourage us to listen with a sound and a good heart. And he, over the course of his ministry, he speaks about who are we listening to, what are we listening to, and how are we listening. And I confess, when I started to have a look at what Pope Francis had to say about listening, I thought to myself, well, listening is sort of automatic. It's one of the life skills that you can't mess up, isn't it? we should be able to do this automatically. But the more I began to read about what he had to say about listening, I began to realize there's a lot more to listening than I had really thought. And so there was a lot of learning. The key to Pope Francis' understanding, we'll see if we can unpack this together, is that the goal of listening is to create the closeness that makes love possible, to create the closeness that makes love possible. And it's part of our religious tradition. It's really interesting that when you look at the Ten Commandments, we always flash to the Ten Commandments, the first, the second, and the third, but it begins by saying, "Listen, Israel. Hear, O Israel." That's the opening statement to the Ten Commandments. And not read, O Israel, but listen. The Lord your God is one, and then you shall. But the very beginning of it was, "Listen, Israel. Hear, O Israel." And then when we look at the history of salvation, we have that lovely story of Solomon being invited. "What would you like?" And he would say, I want to listen with a good heart." That was what I would ask for. If I could ask for any gift in the world, it would be able to hear with a good heart. So much so that by the time you get to Paul and Paul's teaching about faith, Paul says faith comes from listening. Now, in our visual world, particularly our scientific world, we think everything depends on seeing. But the tradition that we're a part of says, oh no, it depends on listening, about hearing, about listening. And I think what Pope Francis wants us to understand is we're not just listening to the sounds that are there, we're listening with a view to saying, how does this help me to enter into my dialogical relationship to God, the back and forth between me and God. And all of that is part of our experience of listening. One of the wonderful things about listening, hearing, is how early it begins to emerge in our life, too. I mean, in our mother's womb, touch is one of the first senses that we develop in the womb, is touch. And of course, our heart starts to beat at a pretty early age. But the organism that helps us to hear develops phenomenally early in the womb. It's really quite amazing that, by the time we get to 18 weeks, we can hear our mother's heartbeat in the womb. And by 27 weeks, we can hear voices outside of the womb. That's really a phenomenal thing. Eyesight takes much longer to develop once we're born, but we're already listening in the womb to the world around us. So listening is one of the early and most important senses that we have in our life, and it happens at a really early age. And what listening does to us, and this is something Pope Francis is very conscious of, is listening puts us, in his words, on the map. Now, we think about this. If you get an ear infection, one of the things that it affects is your balance, right? It kind of affects our balance. Pope Francis sees that as at a much deeper level and says, hearing orients us to where we are and to the times we live in. So hearing actually locates us in history, and hearing locates us in time and space. So hearing is one of those orientating phenomena that we have, that we depend on in order to know where we are in life and how we fit into life. And it's a dominant experience for us. So for instance, when you compare hearing to reading and speaking and writing, here's the comparison. We listen to a book a day. Think about that. Over the course of a day, we listen to a whole book a day. We speak a book a week. We think we're talking all the time, or I am, but anyway. But we listen to a book a day. We speak a book a week. We read a book a month. And we write a book a year. So proportionately, that's how significant listening is compared to speaking and reading and writing. So when you go to school, you get classes in reading and writing and speaking. You get any classes on listening? None. We assume we all know how to do that. So most important communication system we have, we use it the most. It's one of the dominant things in our life. No one ever tries to teach us how to listen. We spend almost no time on learning how to listen. And Pope Francis he outlined some of the challenges that we face in this journey of trying to listen. And there really are problems with our culture. A lot of them are cultural problems. And as you go through the list, you kind of think to yourself, to what degree does this one fit into me? So one of the ones he identifies is we're rootless. We live in a rootless world. In his language, we fly solo. So he said, basically, we're disconnected from the world we live in, the space we live in, the time we live in. We kind of transit over across time and space above it all as if it doesn't really matter what's going on below us or beneath us. So one of the oddities that we experience today is it used to be if you phoned somebody and they answered the phone, you could draw the conclusion they were at home. You know, because that's how communication worked. Now they could be anywhere, you know. They could pick up the phone, they could be in Hawaii. You know, so we have this sense that we're not really rooted anywhere. We're just where we are all by ourselves. As long as I got my phone, I can be anywhere, I can do anything, I can say anything. In fact, one of his images about this, in that sense, he says we're promiscuous people. Now, we tend to identify promiscuity as something with irresponsible sexuality, but promiscuity basically means wandering. He said we're a wandering culture. We kind of wander all over the globe. We wander in and out of different activities. We're not located anywhere. And so when we think about the basic necessities of life, we think about food, water, warmth, all of those things. We don't put lodging down. That doesn't cross our mind as an essential to life, lodging, because we're of the opinion, I can live anywhere. I can move over here, I can move there, I can do this. We don't consider lodging to be an essential necessity for life, and not just to have a place, but to stay there, to live there, and to make it a home, to make it permanent, to make it a lodging where we can call this home. And he says as a consequence of that, because we don't have anything around us that tells us where we're at home, we fail to appreciate our first lodging, which is the earth. We're consumed about everything else, but because we don't understand lodging, we don't appreciate our primary home, which is the planet that we live on. The second problem that he identifies when it comes to listening is we live in a narcissistic world. And I think by that he means that we're always hearing echoes of our own opinion all the time, especially in the world of social media, that if you've ever searched for something online, the next time you turn your computer on, you get 6 ads for whatever you looked at yesterday. Like we're being tracked all the time, and we're being fed whatever we want to see and hear. So what happens in the digital world tends to a large extent also happen to us socially. And I suspect with COVID, that was aggravated because we were limited in our social connection, so we had to pick and choose who we were going to see. And by and large, we picked and chose people who we identified with. So we screened out all kinds of different opinions, different ideas, different thoughts. We just screened them out so that we all were living in this little silo. And actually, we're only listening to ourselves in this silo. We're only hearing what I think about whatever that subject might be. And Pope Francis says that's not how you build a life. You can't build a life on like and dislike. He said binary. He said it's a binary world that we live in. He said you can't construct a meaningful life when the only people you have in your life are those people who think like you think, who agree with your opinion, and then you can dismiss and cut off anybody who's different from ourselves. And then he talks about some false gods that affect us in life. One of them is populism, but I think he means the movements that we exist in our world that look like we're banding together for a value, for a good idea. And we've seen some of that in Canada, we see some of that in the States. But he said, inevitably what happens is these, on the surface, they look like popular movements, but inevitably, he says, hostility is what characterizes the bonds that hold them together. It becomes a movement that's based on hostility and anger, not on love and kindness. And the second false god that he talks about is liberalism. He said, we're pursuing the attempt to be free. I don't want anybody to tell me what to do. I don't want anybody to restrict my life. And as a result of that, he said, we create a world of self-interested individuals who have no connections to the people around them. So he said those are some of the false gods that affect us in our life. And he said when it comes to hearing, we have all kinds of misconceptions about hearing. And it's a really interesting list. He said one of our misconceptions is hearing is the same as listening. Now, those of you who are married probably know how definitely not true that is. Where you're speaking to your spouse and they're nodding away, they're hearing, but they're not listening. There's no listening going on here at all. Listening is agreement. Another misconception. We have this idea that if someone listens to me, it means they agree with me. Pope Francis says, no. We can listen and not agree. He said, we need to be able to acknowledge that that's a reality. Listening develops naturally because it's something automatic. No, listening is hard work. It takes a lot of effort. It takes skills to learn how to listen. It doesn't develop naturally. Listening needs intelligence. Pope Francis, no, the simplest person, the child, can listen sometimes better than the adult. It doesn't require IQ to be able to listen. Reading is the same as listening. Folks, another misconception. No, those are two different activities, two different phenomena. And another one is listening is passive. If I'm listening, I'm not doing anything. Pope Francis, no, listening is hard work. If you're listening, you're going to be working. It's not passive. And one of the experiences, understanding depends on the speaker. If I don't get the message, it's the speaker's problem. No. I'm part of the equation. I'm part of the dialogue. I have an equal responsibility when it comes to understanding what's being said as a person who's presenting this. And one of the interesting things he talks about is the sin of Babel. Remember that story in the Old Testament? About all the people of the world decided we're going to get together, we're going to construct a tower, and the tower is going to reach up to the sky. And then God confounded the peoples of the world, and that is what resulted in the dispersion of different languages and different peoples around the world. Pope Francis says, the real sin of the Tower of Babel is, I think I know what Michael's going to say before Michael finishes saying it. He said, that's the real sin of Babel, is I assume I know what someone else is saying, even though they haven't finished what they're talking about. There's a little, it was a really interesting survey in England, and they did a survey on conversations. So they basically just tape people who are having conversations and to study the phenomena of the conversation. And what they noticed is the interval between when I stop speaking and someone else starts speaking is 1/5 of a second. So not much time elapses between when one person stops speaking and another person starts speaking. And they also did a study on if I show you a picture of a pencil or something, or I hold this up, it takes you 1/2 a second to come up with the word phone. It takes that long to put the word phone mentally attached to that object. So when you do the math on this, if it takes that much time to come up with a word in my mind about what was just experienced, and it only takes us 1/5 of a second to start talking, that means we're already forming our opinion about what I'm going to say next before that person has finished what they're talking about. I've stopped listening for the last third of their sentence or whatever, and I'm already constructing the opening line in what I'm about to say. And so Pope Francis says, we talk past each other. We're not listening to half of what's being said. We talk past each other because we're already preoccupied with what I am going to say next in my argument. And as a consequence of this, what Pope Francis suggests to us is we have really fragmented lives. We have a social life and a business life or a work life, and our life is made up of bits and pieces, but it's not coherent. And we might discover we're in another setting and we realize, oh, that isn't what I think about that. I have a different opinion over here when I'm in this environment, and I have another opinion when I'm with these people. And the result of that, he said, we live these fragmented lives that are both historically fragmented. Our past isn't necessarily connected with our present, but even simultaneously, we might occupy two different worlds and have different opinions in the different worlds because of all of these pulls that are taking place and tugging us in different directions and telling us what we think, and we don't really know what it is we really think or believe about much of anything. So, how does he suggest we start? Well, basically, Pope Francis says we have to start by listening to ourselves. And that means we have to turn off this automatic pilot that mostly runs our life. We go through our life without aware of what we're doing, aware of what we're saying, aware of what's going on around us. Turn off the autopilot, he says, and accept that. Quit imitating what other people are telling you that you ought to believe or to think. And he says we have to start by looking into our hearts to see what is really present there, what's going on inside of ourselves. And he cautions us, he said, that glimpse of what's going on inside of us will not be pretty. He said, you're not going to like what you see in there. I came across this description by C.S. Lewis. He was talking about what he saw when he looked into his heart. He was appalled, he said. I saw a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. I love that one. A harem of fondled hatreds. My name is Legion, he said. This is the chaos that's inside of us. And he said, so you have to, and the temptation once we see that is, I can't face this. I'm going to get busy. I'm going to the gym. I'm going shopping. I'm going to turn the TV on. I'm going to do anything but face this chaos that's going on inside of myself. So he says we have to stay present to that and ask ourselves, quit being attentive to what you feel. He said, everybody has feelings. And he said, but mostly the reality is the feelings have us. We'd like to think we have feelings, but actually we're possessed by our own feelings. They drive us. So put aside for a moment what you feel about something and start to begin to ask yourself, what is it that you're really convinced about? Not what do I feel, but what am I really convinced about? What conviction do I have in my heart that is an anchor conviction? What am I convinced about? Not just what I feel or what I like or what I want, but what am I convinced about? He said that's where we start to hear ourselves and to understand something about ourselves. And he said, and that takes a real gift of silence to do that. Pope Francis notes that Gandhi used to spend every Monday in silence. Didn't speak at all on Mondays, just so there'd be real silence in his life so he could hear what was going on inside himself. And Pope Francis says we have to learn how to do that, to listen like a Quaker who listens. They learn to listen to each other because of their conviction that there is in every person something of God in their heart. And if we listen deeply enough, we will hear that voice of God in our sisters and brothers, and especially in ourselves. And we have to listen, and this is like God. So Pope Francis says, at the center of God is a listening being. That God is not a single being, but from the very beginning of creation, God has presented himself to us as a trinity of persons. And in God, there is a listening and a speaking. There's a back and a forth, a giving and a receiving. And he says that's the most important revelation that the Christian community has ever made to the world. That at the center of God, there's not a monad, a single being. There's a community of persons who listen to each other, who speak and listen. The Father listens to the Son listens to the Father. That's the center of God. Before there was anything in creation, there is this listening being at the center of God. And this is what creates the world, is this action of giving and receiving. It's at the center of God, and God has entrusted to us this experience of listening to one another, speaking and listening. And he said at the very beginning of creation, what we see is God's desire to hear what we have to say. Now, I often, and I'm sure you do too, have thought, well, God's the one who does everything. We're the ones who are just passive. God's the one who creates by speaking. But if you remember that story in Genesis, after God had created, God brought to the first human being to hear what he would call them. Do you remember that line? To hear the name that he would give them. So at the very beginning of creation, you have this image of God saying, I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you are going to call my creation. I want to listen to you. And then after the tragedy in the garden, God comes looking for them. And they're hiding from God because God wanted to listen to them. I want to hear from you. I want to hear what's going on in your heart, and you're hiding from me. So Pope Francis says at the very beginning, we're blessed with this insight into God who wants to listen to us. This is the dearest part of God. He wants to listen to us. And every human being, all of us, the mission that we have, it's essential for us to understand that we have to listen as part of that experience. So when you look at the life of Jesus, his mission begins when he hears the divine voice at his baptism saying to him, "This is my beloved Son." He has to hear that and then discern that that mission belongs to me, and then begin to act on it when he goes to the temple and says, "Today, this mission is fulfilled in your presence." Listening, discerning, and then acting. But it always begins with listening. So once we've been set free from all of these tug-of-wars, then we can begin to listen to each other. And Pope Francis says the purpose of listening is to run the risk of closeness. That's his term, the risk of closeness. And the image he uses for that is the story of the Good Samaritan. He says the Good Samaritan is primarily about listening, because there were some people that walked by who had important things to do, and if they got involved with this injured person, they would have been disqualified from going to the temple. So he said so they excused themselves because they had other important things to do. But the Samaritan listened. He saw what had happened, and he listened to him, and he took the risk of drawing close to the one who was injured. It was that risk of closeness. And as a consequence of that, Pope Francis says, that's how you inevitably will become a neighbor to someone else, is by listening, running the risk of drawing close, and inevitably you're going to become a neighbor to the other. If, he says, you can encounter reality. Because listening, he said, is always going to bring us close to reality, and reality is difficult for us to hear. And he said, often the only way you can hear what's really going on in the world is in tears. If you're going to listen to what's going on in the world, you will experience it in tears, in crying, because there's nothing else you can do when you face the reality of what our sisters and brothers are experiencing. Tears and silence. And he said, what silence does is silence amplifies reality. And there's two images that come to mind when you think about what that means for Pope Francis. One of them is he was during COVID, he decided to offer a prayer for the world. You might remember the scene. So he's praying in the center of St. Peter's Square, and it's completely empty. It's a nighttime. He's in the middle of the square in a little baldacchino that's set up there with some lights. The rain is falling. There's no one else in the square. And he's praying in silence for the world. Well, that picture went around the globe. It wasn't noisy. It was pure silence. And the other image was when, in the wheelchair, he parked himself on the edge of Lac St. Anne when he visited us in the summer. Some of you might remember that. All we saw was by himself, next to the water, in silence, in the chair. That's listening. And a profound picture, because you know in that moment he's hearing all the tears and the sorrow and the tragedy of our world. And what you saw it in the tears, and you saw it in the silence. So Pope Francis says, if you're going to be a neighbor, this is the risk you're going to take. You're going to have this experience. You're going to face reality, which is really difficult to hear, and you're going to have to hear it in tears and in silence if you're going to draw close and become neighbor to our sisters and brothers. He talks about the apostolate of the ear. When we get into that situation, the apostolate of the ear. And he means two things by that. First of all, it's making room for the other person. Making room for what's going on in their life. So he said, first of all, you have to resist the temptation to come up with a solution. This is probably a note to all the men in the world, Resist the temptation to have an answer here, because I confess that's one of my weaknesses. I'm going to answer that problem. He said, no. Resist the temptation to have a solution and simply make room for what they are trying to say. That means you have to banish all claims to power, listen for a long time, and be prepared to change your mind. He said that's an essential ingredient of making room for the other, is don't offer a solution, listen to them, be prepared to change your mind. And he uses a kind of a colloquial expression. He said, when you're trying to discover the truth, he says, you don't stop at the first tavern. Great image. Don't listen to the first group of people you meet who are telling you what's going on. You got to listen more than that. And then the other thing he says about the apostle of the year is you have to grasp the good that is present in each person, that no person deserves to be written off. Every person contains goodness, and we have to be able to find out what is the goodness that's contained in this person, to treasure them and to give value to them, We have to be able to work at that. As I'm listening, I'm thinking, what's the value in this person? What is the good that this person contains? How do I treasure this individual? Especially, he says, those who are on the edge, on the periphery. They have something else to tell us. I was thinking about that when we were listening to that sad story in Winnipeg about the missing women, and they couldn't find their bodies, and they thought the bodies might have been left in a land disposal site in Winnipeg, and the reaction to it was, well, we can't stop what we're doing here and look for these women. They're not that important. And they persisted and said, no, they are that important. We have to find a way to listen to what they're telling us. Because one of the ironies in all of that is we created the dump because we throw out so much stuff. One of the lessons is there wouldn't be a dump if we had a different lifestyle. There wouldn't be a place to discard human beings. But because we were so quick to say, no, we can't do that. We can't listen to your tragedy. We have to get on with life. We're going to move forward on this project and write them off. It was really interesting listening to that tug of war about, can we listen deeper here and hear more of what's going on here? And what are the lessons it needs to speak to us? Pope Francis says, listening is sacrificial. There's a martyrdom connected with listening, and we need to be able to pay the price of that martyrdom. And we experience that in our ordinary life. We're often talking to someone and they go around and around, when they're talking about something, or they repeat something over and over again, they say it over and over again. I know I've heard that, God, but, or it takes them a long time to finally say what they want to say. He said, there's a martyrdom connected with listening, and we have to be able to pay that price. And it is a kind of a martyrdom. And then he says, and we have to be able to calm our bodies down and be ready to be surprised. And there's two images that writers have talked about, and one is related to Mother Teresa and one is related to Pope Francis. They say about Mother Teresa, when she looks, she sees. When she looks, she sees. And Pope Francis notes about this. He said, the human face has the ability to create up to 8,000 different expressions, some of which last just a second. So if you're going to listen, you have to see, and you have to look at what you're seeing. You have to really see. And what they say about Pope Francis is, when he hears, he listens. He can really hear. So between these two kind of modern saints, if you will, one who when she sees, when she looks, she sees, and when he hears, he listens. They're great models for us about how to use our sight and our hearing in order to build community. And he has some stuff to say about listening in our church. And one of the things he says about our church is he does not want our church to be a museum church. A beautiful place, but mute, where it has a rich past and no future. Interesting image. He said, our church, and he said, if we're going to have something more than that, we have to learn to listen to each other, and we have to get over the polarization that is dividing our church. We have to, and that's going to be accomplished by listening. We have to refrain from aggressively defending dogma and doctrine, because he said that's not helping the cause. He says, stop aggressively defending dogma. The church is going to be fine, but we have to learn to listen to each other. To resist the temptation to find quick solutions to problems, Pope Francis calls that triumphalist thinking. And he said, and to resist the temptation is one, because I have spoken, the truth is now available. Pope Francis says truth or meaning happens when two different horizons intersect. So this other person, the horizon of their life and the horizon of my life, when they intersect, that's where meaning is going to happen, in that intersection. So it's not a matter of, in the past, what our church's approach was, There's God's truth, and there's my truth, and there's your truth. And as a messenger, as a cleric or something, I'm going to take God's truth and deliver it to you, and once you hear it, now you possess it. No, Pope Francis said, no, you have to hear the truth they possess. And when the meaning, the horizon of meaning in their life connects with the horizon of meaning in your life, that's where you're going to discover meaning, and that's where you're going to discover the truth that you need to be able to operate on. And an essential ingredient of this, and this is kind of interesting, he says we have to be convinced that we are incomplete, that the other person has something to tell me that is essential. So we start off by saying, I am incomplete until I hear what other people have said to me. And to allow their experience, whatever it might be, to have some authority in the conversation. To have authority in the conversation. That means their experience has value and weight, and I need to give their experience value and weight as I'm listening to them. So dialogue for Pope Francis is not techniques. He said it's a costly engagement. If you're dialoguing with someone else, this is going to be costly. It's going to take something from you, and it will take something from them if you're going to engage in a real dialogue. It's going to be costly. And when he says, and we have dialogue, he said it involves all of the people. He laments the fact that in our culture today, we tend to work on, we tend to have two kind of problems. One is we'll let the elites make the decision for us, the experts, we'll call the experts in, they're going to tell us what the answer is, and their answer is only going to be applicable to a significant portion of the population. We can't solve all your problems, so we'll solve yours, and we're just going to have to write this group off because we can't make a solution that'll fit them too. So we're just going to concentrate on the ones who we can fix, and we'll write the other ones off. Pope Francis says, no, you haven't listened enough. If that's where you are, you haven't listened enough. You have to listen some more and find a deeper answer, a deeper truth. It involves all of the people, not a group and not an elite. He says in this process of listening and dialoguing, he said it's like a dance, he said. It has different steps to it. And he said you have to understand and make sure all the steps are present. So he said at times it will require you to be bold and speak out and make sure you declare your opinion. At other times it's going to require you to be humble and listen and say, no, you tell me what you're thinking about this. He said on some occasions you will be the learner, and they will be the teacher. On other occasions, they will be you'll be the teacher and they will be the learner. Those roles get reversed. At times, it will be really important to speak up. At other times, you're going to have to let go of the center of the stage and let someone else speak. And he said, for a real dialogue, all of those steps should be in play. All of those things should be going on, and everybody should be engaged in all of them. It's not that one person does all the teaching and one does all the learning. We take turns at this. It goes back and forth. His description of this is dialogue is a slow, risky movement that asks everyone to be teachable, open, and patient. Slow, risky movement that asks everyone to be teachable and patient. I think that's a wonderful description. And in fact, he starts it at the very top. So a number of years ago when he called the cardinals together for one of the synods in Rome, and traditionally what happens is they would come to Rome and they would discuss something. It might have been youth, or it might have been family, or whatever it was. And we all looked on from a distance and thought, oh, they're all discussing and they're going to tell us what's supposed to happen. So before the synod in 2016, he told the bishops, he said, in the past, he said, when you have arrived in Rome to participate in the synod, you were told the Holy Father does not want to hear about this. You were told the Holy Father does not want this topic brought up. So don't bring it up. Oh, I didn't know that. But he said, and they all go, say, yeah, we were told that. He said, that is over. That is not to happen anymore. You come here and you represent a particular church and you have a truth to share with the universal church, and we need to hear it, even if it causes pain to somebody who's listening. And he called this a particular kind of speaking called parrhesia. And he said it's when somebody who is vulnerable speaks to somebody who is in power at the risk of suffering. He said, that's a particular kind of speech, and we need it to happen in the church, where somebody down here speaks to somebody in power and says something they're not going to like to hear, and they run a risk of it being costly. He said, that kind of dialogue has to happen in the church if we're going to grow. I think that's really refreshing when you hear the Holy Father say, we need this kind of conversation. If you think I'm going to be offended by something, speak up. I'm a big boy, I can handle that. I don't want you walking in here and saying, well, he doesn't want to hear this, so I'm not going to talk about whatever the issue might be. He just said, we have to stop that, and we have to speak up. The other thing that he addresses in this conversation is conflict. He said, conflict is a good thing. Now, I was brought up as a kid, quit fighting with your brother, quit fighting with your sister. Conflict was a bad thing. You were punished for fighting. You were punished for disagreeing. Pope Francis says, no, conflict is a good thing, because he says, when we present convictions, ideas, or whatever, about which we are very convinced, eventually in that exchange, we discover what is really important to the individual. And he said, often that's where we discover what are the real truths in life. What are the real human rights? We didn't arrive at human rights in a peaceable manner. We arrived at them by conflict. People disagreed about this. And that's how we eventually hammered out what was important in a culture. And what we also have to, that's the same path we're going to have to follow if we're going to discover what's important in the church. Conflict is essential for us to discover the truth. We need to have conflict without it dragging us down. We need to be able to disagree without it causing polarization. He said, but those things are an important component in listening and in speaking. I'm going to finish with just a couple little comments about two images that he has that I thought were really interesting. One was his favorite image about unity is something called a polyhedron. And so a polyhedron is basically a spherical object, but it has all of these different facets to it. So it's like more like a diamond in a circle where there's different faces. And Pope Francis says each face has some integrity to it and some value all by itself. He said, when you look at it as a circle, the circle is uniform. There's no difference at the edge of the circle. But if you imagine the church as a polyhedron, but all these different faces, each face has a value and has something to contribute to the whole. He said, that's our image of the church. Not uniformity, but beautiful diversity. And his second image is polyphony. He said, when you have a beautiful orchestra that's working, not everybody's singing the same note. Not everybody's in the same key. People are singing different notes, different harmonies, but together we produce the melody, and together we produce the harmony that is our echo of what's going on in heaven, which we'll echo here in a few moments, in the Holy Holy, where we join in that heavenly song where all of the angelic voices are singing in harmony. And he said, and we should be doing the same. That doesn't mean we're singing the same note. It doesn't mean uniformity. It means a beautiful diversity. So those are some thoughts about what Pope Francis has to say about listening. As I went through it, learned myself, I realized I have to be better. I can be better. I have to pay more attention to how I jump to conclusions, how I quit listening, and I have to work a little bit harder on it. I think there's some good lessons there for our church too. So any thoughts about that? Is that helpful enough for today? I've gone on a bit long, but I found it hard to kind of jam it all into half an hour. But you're okay with that? We're all right with